Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this series, we're taking a look at each of the major economies around the world and what they're likely to be prioritising and thinking about when it comes to the Brexit trade negotiations with the UK. In this video, I'll be taking a look at the largest economy in Europe, Germany. But first, if you'd like to stay notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So Britain was a classic case of a country that joined the EEC, as it was back then, for the trade benefits. This is not the case for Germany, for which the political project is also paramount. It was very telling that on the UK surrendering its membership, a former German minister noted just how politically powerful the union had become since Britain first joined. It's a very different relationship that Germany and the UK have and have had with the EU. She described the EU as a global powerhouse, and so it is. I've mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again. When Mark Zuckerberg was in trouble over Facebook's antics recently, a number of bodies wanted to talk to him. The first was the British Parliament. They demanded, Zuckerberg, come over here. We have some questions to ask of you regarding this Cambridge Analytica scandal. He refused. He sent some of his lackey along instead. Following that, the EU Parliament said, hang on a minute, we've got some questions here about this Cambridge Analytica scandal. We need you to come and talk to us. There was no refusal there, no lackeys sent in his stead. Along he went within the week and attended a hearing on exactly the same issues that the British Parliament had demanded to see him about. Large American-based multinationals generally, or certainly in the past, have only really taken their own government seriously. They'll attend some Senate committees and so on, but not in other countries. They act with impunity. But they are now extremely wary of the EU, and this is for two reasons. First of all, because it is so powerful. With a single piece of legislation, they can massively impact the capacity for that corporation to operate as it would like, i.e. very profitably, in the majority of Europe, including the wealthiest nations of Europe. But secondly, the EU are not to be bribed out of taking tough action to protect the interests of their citizens against the worst excesses of capitalism. It's very difficult to bribe them because it is all these countries all involved and all having to, in some cases, unanimously agree to something. Whereas an individual country, there's usually one or two people you need to bribe. The point is that Germany is relishing the power that the EU has, and they've now gone from being one of the big three influential members to one of the big two. So when the EU is negotiating with the UK, there is no way that Germany will allow any weakening of the EU systems in order to accommodate Johnson's unicorns. There will be red lines, and these will be real ones. There will be red lines along environmental standards, worker protections, human rights, as well as the integrity of the single market. They've made that very clear. Germany will also be very key in negotiations, not just because it's the largest member state, that would make it key enough, but also at the sharp end of these negotiations in the second half of 2020, they will have the EU presidency at the time. Germany's also been very open about the fact that this timetable of getting a deal completed by the end of 2020 is entirely of Boris Johnson's making. This has got nothing to do with the EU systems or how it's done. This is 100% Boris Johnson. The rest of the EU are quite happy to extend the transition period and still are. And they're also clear that this is a strategy intended to put pressure on the EU. The problem is that if Johnson wants the sort of deal that would require ratification by each individual member state, which if he wants a very bespoke deal, it will, then it will be quite impossible. Germany would prefer that he moved for a deal that falls entirely under the remit of the EU, where it doesn't need ratification in individual member states, for which agreement in 2020 is possible. And that could only be a loose agreement that removes the need for customs duties and import quotas. Now, this is exactly what Johnson says he wants, but it also comes along with strings which would tie our befuddled Prime Minister in knots. Germany has made it clear that it doesn't expect the UK to simply adopt all EU laws, so that knackers the obvious way of getting such a deal. So the only alternative is equivalence. It essentially means that the UK, when it carries out its own legislative programme, does nothing to undermine EU laws. It wouldn't mean copying EU laws, just making sure that the British ones don't contradict them. And of course, it only needs cover aspects of legislation and the regulations concerned with the trade and other areas of cooperation between the EU and the UK. But that, of course, is bound to constrain Johnson's plans for deregulation of the financial sector. Certainly something that Germany is not going to allow if there is to be a deal. Also, even if Johnson did go down the equivalent route, on the basis that he could do that and tell Brexit supporters that he's completely diverged, and they'll have no idea because they pay no attention to statute, not only would legislation have to not override EU laws, but the paperwork would be needed to prove it. You know, so if you're not just going to copy EU laws, you have to produce the bureaucracy that says, look, well, we've enacted this law, but here's the explanation to show that it's not undermining any of the EU laws. That'd be a lot of extra work. And the UK are likely to want to negotiate quite closely with Germany in particular, you would think. You know, although we say that the EU accounts for 50% of Britain's trade. You know, it's our largest trading partner. Half of what we export goes to the EU, so it's our biggest customer. But Germany on its own is worth 10%. That makes Germany the second biggest customer for the UK in its own right. So that should mean we're a lot more amenable to any requirements they may have from the point of view of British trade, because they're our second biggest customer, as well as Germany being very influential amongst the EU as a whole. Remember, the EU absolutely dwarfs any other customer. But the overriding narrative coming from Germany is as follows. If the UK wants a deal this year, then it has to be one that's based on no tariffs or quotas, because tariffs and quotas take a long time to negotiate. Now, if the UK wants such a deal, then it has to agree to operate on a level playing field in some way. If the UK wants a more bespoke deal, that is, that there will be some tariffs and quotas, even if it's fairly minimal, then the process can barely begin by the end of this year, because it will take years to go through all those. And if the UK insists on ending the transition period this year, that's for definite, but also insists on refusing to agree to the level playing field, then there will be no deal. And it's that simple. And Germany have made that clear. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.